going to begin. I feel like this is my first public thing in a million years with real people in front of me. So what a pleasure that is. Okay, so first thing, just turn your phones off. I did mine. Thank you. Okay, so I'm Dan Rockmore, director of the William H. Newcomb Institute for Computational Science here at Dartmouth College. And on behalf of the college and the Newcomb Institute, I'd like to welcome you to this year's fall colloquium, the title of which is Surveilling the Surveillors: How New Tech Aids the Investigation of Human Rights Abuses and Grave International Crimes. And will be delivered by Alexa, is it Koenig or Koenig?
Okay, however you want to pronounce it.
If I say Koenig, I feel smarter, so I might say Koenig. All right. So from Alexa Koenig, Executive Director of UC Berkeley's Human Rights Center. The Donohoe Colloquium is an ongoing series of public lectures aimed at increasing awareness of the many important and sometimes surprising places in which computational ideas are shaping and changing our lives. These events are made possible by a generous gift from David, Mickey, and Dan Donohoe in honor of Dan's graduation as a member of the class of 2006. It's a central piece of the larger mission of the Newcomb Institute, whose aim is to support and integrate computational thinking and computational ideas throughout the Dartmouth community. The Institute itself is made possible through the generosity of Bill Newcomb, Dartmouth class of 64, and a former trustee of the college. So technology has always been a kind of Janus-faced gift to the world, its effects depending much on who uses or controls it or even develops it. This is perhaps especially true for technology based on computational science. The underlying computational frameworks, the algorithms, the data used to train the algorithms, the protocols that guide the algorithms are, as we now know, not necessarily neutral. Social media platforms share lies as easily as truths, galvanizing all kinds of social movements, some that spur change for the better, while others organize to promote hatred and distrust. The technologies that enable state-sponsored surveillance are, in fact, the same ones that capture acts of violence for which perpetrators are hopefully held accountable. It's a mixed bag for sure, and the impact on human rights is thus chilling, but also thrilling. That said, even when used for the good, the intersection of human rights with technology comes with new challenges, even as it presents new opportunities. There's perhaps no one better suited to tell us about both the opportunities as well as the challenges inherent in the use of technologies for supporting human rights than today's speaker, Alexa Koenig. Alexa is the executive director of UC Berkeley's Human Rights Center, where she's also the center's technology and Human Rights Program Director, and a lecturer in UC Berkeley School of Law. Alexa's visit and lecture is timely not only on a global scale given current events, but also locally as we continue our rollout of the Susan and James Wright Center for the Study of Computation in Just Communities, whose mission is directly relevant for Alexa's work. I've had the privilege of spending a good deal of time with Alexa over just the last 24 hours, and I will confess to be astounded at the range of programs and institutions that her work touches, from the United Nations to the International Criminal Court to the US State Department and beyond. She works at the nexus of the academy and the real world, as evidenced by her co-founding of Berkeley's Investigations Lab, which trains students and professionals to use digital research methods to strengthen investigative reporting, legal investigations, and human rights advocacy. And I believe to date has over 500 alumni. Is that true? Extraordinary. This includes trainings on online open source investigations for the Institute for International Criminal Investigations, UC Berkeley's Advanced Media Institute, attorneys for the International Criminal Court, and others. Alexa received her undergraduate degree from UCLA as a World Arts and Culture major. She then went on to get a JD from the University of San Francisco School of Law, and then, because there wasn't enough, acquired a PhD and master's from Berkeley in jurisprudence and social policy. Alexa is also a member of the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences Committee on Scientific Freedom and Responsibility, and co-chair of the International Bar Association's Human Rights Law Committee, among other posts. She's been honored with the United Nations Association's, I messed up this thing, a Global Human Rights Award, UC Berkeley's Mark Bingham Award for Excellence and Achievement, their Eleanor Swift Award for Public Service, and the Phi Beta Kappa Northern California Teaching Excellence Award. Alexa was also named a 2020 Woman Inspiring Change by Harvard Law School. Her recent books include Digital Witness, Using Open Source Information for Human Rights Investigation, Documentation, and Accountability, and another book, Hiding in Plain Sight. I don't know how she's able to do so much for so many, but her energy and effort should be an inspiration to all of us. So please join me in welcoming our 2021 Fall Donahoe Colloquium speaker, Dr. Alexa Koenig.
I've been told I can take this off if I'm 6 feet away, so I'm going to try and stay here and not communicate any germs on any of you. But thank you, Dan, so much for that very kind introduction and also for the very warm welcome that I've had during my time here at Dartmouth. It's been truly inspirational to have a chance to meet so many faculty, so many people who are so deeply engaged in thinking about how new and emerging technologies can strengthen social justice around the world. And of course, a huge thank you as well to the Newcomb Institute and everyone who's part of it. I'm incredibly honored to have this chance to talk with you today about some stuff that I care very deeply about. So today I want to tell you a little bit about what's happening in human rights communities and international criminal legal communities in terms of bringing together people from across disciplines to have positive social impact. As Dan mentioned, I work with the Human Rights Center, where I've been since 2007 and in the position of executive director since 2012. We were founded in 1994 on the Berkeley campus to be a multi- and interdisciplinary center where we could bring together people ranging from journalists to lawyers to public health practitioners and others to work on issues of mutual concern. But even though we were founded in 1994, the story I want to start with today actually comes from a couple decades earlier, specifically March 1976 in Argentina. At that time, a young man named Eric Stover, who would go on eventually to help found our Human Rights Center at Berkeley, was backpacking through the country. He had a letter from the Associated Press in his backpack, and he was there to report on growing civil unrest. But unfortunately, he and his brother were there on the night of the military coup that March. He was beaten up with his brother, and the two of them were thrown into a prison cell. That night, as the night wore on, many other young students, activists, journalists, and others were thrown in that prison cell with them. And when dawn broke, he was ejected from the country along with his brother, which he credits to having an American passport. But unfortunately, those people who were jailed with him that evening were never heard from again. That ultimately pivoted his career from journalism to thinking about human rights and the fate of the disappeared around the world. Long story short, he went on to work on exhumations of mass grave sites in the former Yugoslavia, in places like Argentina, in Iraq, etc. But before he got there, he went to Amnesty International, worked with them in the 1970s in London, then went on to work with the American Association for the Advancement of Science. It was there in 1983, as the military junta lost power, that 3 women came to visit him in his office. One of them carried in her purse a rumpled up piece of newspaper, a newspaper clipping that was talking about a new form of technology, specifically DNA technology, that had recently been shown to be able to establish the paternity of somebody with an infant. The question she and the 2 other women had in that office that day was, can this also be used as a form of new technology to establish grand paternity? And they told him their story. One of the women was Estela Carlotto, who would go on to found the Grandmothers of the Disappeared. Her daughter, Laura, had been detained in 1977 in Argentina. Unbeknownst to Estela at the time, her daughter was 3 months pregnant at the time of her detention. Laura's boyfriend and the father of her baby was immediately killed. But because the military junta was Catholic, they didn't believe in killing women who were pregnant because that would also kill their unborn child. So according to people who had eventually escaped and lived, they had come and told her that her daughter had been pregnant, had been kept alive long enough to have her grandchild, a grandson, and ultimately Laura had been killed a few hours after giving birth. The baby, most likely, like many of the infants that were born to detainees, were likely given to a military family or another family in the country, or as we would later work on at the Human Rights Center, families in the United States or abroad. So Estella now was asking because she wanted to find the child who was called Guido and to see if the DNA technology could be used to help that effort. Eric said, I don't know, but I know a few people who might be able to help. And he flew across the country, picking up Clyde Snow, a forensic anthropologist, and a chemist and geneticist at UC Berkeley, and they went down to Argentina. When they got there, they had been anticipating working with local university professors, academics, practitioners, but what they found instead was that the unrest was still too sensitive, and nobody was willing to work with them to see what had happened to these children, or to the parents that had been killed. So what he did instead was he started working with the local university and ended up working with a series of students who would go on to work with him to create the Argentine Forensic Anthropology team. They would work for quite some time unearthing mass grave sites and trying to use both traditional forensic anthropological methods, but also DNA technology to try and identify the dead and work with the families that were still grieving their loved ones to figure out what could be helpful. He noticed at the time, though, a tension. International legal investigators often need only one body, one person, to try and help establish that a crime has taken place and who might be responsible. But in this case, in working with the families of the disappeared, of course, families want to know what happened to their child or to their loved one. And so that began his life's work of thinking through how we better integrate families into the processes that can often be quite alienating as part of the course of justice. Fast forward to the Human Rights Center, it's 2011, and the International Criminal Court has just been in operation for 10 years. And our center, like many around the world, are beginning to ask the question of, well, how is the International Criminal Court doing in its mandate to try to prosecute the highest level perpetrators for the most grave crimes? And the answer was not particularly well. There were 4 cases that had recently fallen apart at very early stages of prosecution in the international community. And so we began to ask the question, why? We sent a PhD student from history to the International Criminal Court where she went through hundreds, if not thousands, of pages of court records. And she came back to us and said, the judges are all saying the same thing. The predominant problem about why these prosecutions are not proceeding is because they are allegedly over-relying on the stories of survivors. And while the stories of survivors will always be the beating heart of many of these cases, they're the reason we take them up in the first place, according to the judges, that wasn't enough to meet the forensic standards required to allow the cases to progress. So the big question that many of us began asking was what new forms of information might be available that would help corroborate what these survivors of mass atrocity are saying happened in their communities, or be used to disprove that information. If you think about what was happening in 2011, it was the heart of the Arab Spring. Human rights activists were beginning to figure out new ways to use digital methods of connectivity to communicate with each other and to push for change. At the same time, the smartphone was beginning to proliferate around the globe, allowing people in sites of atrocity to begin to capture in video format and as pictures, images of what was taking place. And of course, social media was also rapidly on the rise. That was providing a new conduit for people in sites of conflict to share information with international investigators, with human rights groups, et cetera. So we pulled together a series of 4 workshops, and you can see the reports up on this screen, to bring together technologists with human rights advocacy groups and researchers, with investigators from the International Criminal Court, the former Yugoslavia Tribunal, that from the former Rwanda, Lebanon, et cetera, to talk about how new forms of fact-finding were being made possible by the advent of these new and emerging technologies. We were looking at the potential for the use of big data analytics, satellite imagery, which had suddenly become commercially available and was no longer just in the purview of governments. Also, this information that was rapidly proliferating, where people were frantically sending to the International Criminal Court the videos and the photographs that they were taking, alleging war crimes and other abuses. The problem was the prosecutors were drowning now in these videos and these photographs. And the kinds of videos and photographs they were being sent was the stuff that people, of course, on the ground care about. It was the actual body of their loved one, or it was the site of the bomb attack. But what the prosecutors and investigators really needed was not more proof that a crime had taken place. What they needed was the lead information that would get them to other sources of evidence, like the witnesses who could tell them what had happened, or the physical evidence, like the soil samples or the DNA tests that might give some additional evidence. They also needed the linkage evidence. Linkage evidence is the information that ties the on-the-ground atrocity, so the killing or the rape, to the highest level perpetrator, the commander who is responsible for what took place. Because at places like the International Criminal Court, they are mandated to only go after that top person, and sometimes creating that chain, that network, is really quite challenging. But what new opportunities do social networks provide, if not to provide some of the connections between people? And so many of us began asking, can we leverage the network of relationships that are captured in these digital spaces to begin to draw the connections of who likely did what to whom, where, when, and how? As part of that, we were also seeing a growing area of practice that had been started by the intelligence community, had been picked up on by journalists, of using social media and other publicly available online information to help make sense of what was happening in the world. There was a group of 4 reporters in Ireland at the time who created the organization Storyful. And they had a computer scientist on their team, as well as these traditional reporters. And what they had learned to do was design algorithms to detect flurries of activity on social media, to turn their attention to where something was likely happening in the world, and to quickly assess the reliability of that user-generated content, the content people at the location were uploading, and figure out how to share it with major media. They turned a $150,000 investment into a $25 million enterprise that eventually was bought just 4 years later. And I think really did help to push forward the thinking about how social media content, because of its immediacy, because of its reactive abilities, because of its emotive qualities, can be quite powerful in helping us round out our understanding of facts on the ground. However, getting that information, considering the speed and scale with which that information is transmitted, can be quite difficult. Many of you have probably heard the statistics or similar ones that now 6,000 tweets are being generated every second, more than 500 hours of video are being uploaded to YouTube every minute. A colleague of ours has described the challenge of finding the specific information you need, something akin to finding a needle in a haystack made of needles. So we found that it was really challenging and time-consuming to ultimately sort through and sift through that information manually. And at the time, we were also beginning to ask, what is it we have at UC Berkeley that maybe could contribute to the larger arc of justice and fill a space that no one else is filling? And we realized our biggest asset was probably the fact that we come from a campus of 55,000 people, many of whom are deeply committed to social justice, who come from across disciplines, and also are quite international. So they have the language skills, et cetera, to do this work and to do it across different conflicts. As part of that, we decided in 2016 to create the Investigations Lab as a first experiment to see if we could bring people together from across the campus to do the painstaking work of sourcing information from social media and then assessing its reliability for 3 sets of end users. And those were ultimately journalists and investigative reporters more generally, legal investigators, and then the third bucket being human rights researchers. And to this day, we have continued to work with those 3 groups because they are all ultimately, at their heart, fact finders, people who are trying to figure out how we better understand what facts are happening in the world, even though what they ultimately do with it may be quite different. As we got further and further into this work, both with the International Criminal Court and others, we did realize that there was a relative lack of standards or guidelines on how to do this work well. And one of the things we were growing increasingly concerned about was how incredibly convincing a lot of the aggregated information, pulling together open and closed source data, videos, and photographs can be about telling a story of what's taken place. But how do you go about probing the reliability of not only that narrative, but also the underlying assets? Judges seemed somewhat perplexed in some instances with what to do with that information, and we had a growing fear that they were either going to do one of two things. They were either going to say these kind of representations coming from social media are so convincing that they were in some ways determinative of what had actually taken place, or that on the flip side, they would say, we don't know how to probe the quality of this kind of new style of work, and as a result would discount things that had taken hundreds of hours for people to pull together, but also that the original people had sometimes risked their lives to actually document. So we started working with the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to build a set of guidelines that hopefully would be helpful to people entering this work, whether legal practitioners or not, to better understand that if they're collecting this information, they're sourcing this information and assessing its reliability, here are some standard ways to think about that to help ensure that the information could feed into legal process. We held a 3-day workshop to bring together a number of different people working in the space to talk this through. We wanted to start by getting some common terminology. What I thought would take 2 hours ended up being a full day of just coming up with the definition that you see here. So ultimately where we landed was that digital open source information is information that's accessible on the internet, that any member of the public can access by observation, so typing in your keywords and seeing what pops up, by request, so you may have to enter your email address to actually get access to a website because there's some kind of gatekeeping function, or by purchase. And by purchase, we don't mean something that's expensive, but something that may be relatively nominal, like paying for a New York Times subscription. It also can't be anything where you need a special status to access that information, so it can't be that you're required to be law enforcement and have a warrant. It also can't be something that you obtain through illegal activity, like some form of hacking. As part of this, we were also working with Amnesty International to see if we could build an international network of university students who could be doing this work and really innovating and thinking through how new platforms were creating new affordances for documenting atrocity. Ultimately, this became a project that is now engaging 7 universities around the world, ranging from Hong Kong to Mexico City, to Pretoria in South Africa, to several places in the United Kingdom, Canada, and ourselves. These students, at least on our team, represent more than 24 different disciplines and majors and collectively speak more than 30 languages. And I just want to show you a quick clip of some of the work that's been done by our team, just for any of you who are new to this space to see some of what we are actually trying to pull together.
Egypt yesterday witnessed its strongest protest in probably 4 decades.
I was living in Egypt in 2011 when the revolution happened. I was really moved by the risks that I saw everyday citizens take to stand up to authority and to document abuses by the authority. I certainly struggled with guilt about leaving, and this question of how can I, from the sidelines, support the incredible activism and not just leave and never look back.
At the Human Rights Investigations Lab, we train students to comb through social media and other publicly accessible platforms on the internet to see if they can find evidence related to human rights abuses and to war crimes that are happening around the world. You'd be amazed how often videos are circulated and you're being told that this is actually Syria today, when maybe it came from Ethiopia 5 years ago. So a big piece of what our students are doing is really fact-checking.
This is Smart News Agency. They depend on citizens using their cell phones to go out and document what is going on in Syria. This appears to be the bombing of an aid convoy. Whenever I see cluster munitions, that is something we would be particularly interested in because those are illegal weapons in this conflict. The first thing I do is I look at when it was published, and I try to figure out if that's really the first time it was uploaded onto the internet. Turns out this video was uploaded for the first time here on YouTube on August 3rd. The other thing I start doing is translating and trying to figure out as much detail as possible. They claim that this attack happened towards the western entrance of this city. I'm going to go to satellite imagery now and start looking at the roads that are leading from El Tarib west.
So a lot of what you'll find, a lot of what I do is just like opening. When we do training for digital verification, a lot of people come along and think there's a silver bullet for verification, and actually there's not. Probably the trickiest part of the whole verification techniques we use is trying to work out exactly where a photograph or video was actually taken or captured or filmed. But often it's the most important thing we can do.
So the goal is to make sure that this video is saved and that we analyze as much information as possible from this video so that hopefully it can be used in a legal investigation or one day in a case seeking legal accountability for this attack.
To be able to have the people who are already there sending information out, either through videos that they post to YouTube or videos that they post to Facebook, that means we're hearing stories we've never actually heard before and wouldn't have otherwise. One group that we're working with is the Syrian Archive.
We'll see if we get them the first try.
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah.
We have about 600 videos only related to chemical weapons attacks, but they are not analyzed. What you are doing is the most important, is analyzing and doing open source investigations, which we really don't have the capacity to do right now.
So I've gone back to work on one of the convoy videos. I'm having a really hard time really geolocating it, partly because it's on just a big rural road.
Just send me the materials and we can work on it together.
Okay. Thank you so much, Hadi. I really appreciate this.
Welcome.
We all really love working on your projects. They give us a lot of meaning in our lives, so thank you so much.
Thank you. No, thank you. Thank you guys so much.
I have probably found some coordinates that are where the bombing for those trucks took place on August 3rd, 2016. There's this really interesting moment of excitement when you think you've really found it. And there's a part of me that is absolutely yearning for a lot more accountability and waiting to see what happens with this information.
If you're going after the president of a country or a commanding general, the last thing you want is these cases falling apart. Our students go through the painstaking work of verifying so that courts and human rights investigators knew how much they could rely on that information and ultimately get those stories out to the world.
What I hope for Andrea and for any of the students to take with them is just the skills that they've gained, that they're able to disseminate that through work that they do for better social good.
The students who come out of this are going to be part of a pipeline that's never really existed before. And the potential for them to help various fields of practice is enormous.
It's actually with this work that I've kind of gotten rid of a lot of that guilt. This work allows me to feel like I can directly give something back to the activists who take so much risk to document these human rights violations.
So the inspiration for the lab was very much based on Eric's work of thinking through how students are sometimes best situated with their curiosity around the world, their facility with digital technologies, to help push the boundaries of what is already happening and help bring something into a next generation. We have gone on since then. That was taped in the first few months that we were in existence, back in 2016, 2017, to have collaborations with Reuters, with the New York Times, with the Washington Post, with the Associated Press, with the United Nations Commissions of Inquiry, with Amnesty International, Physicians for Human Rights. Essentially, that pipeline that I talked about in the film ended up being much bigger than I had even begun to imagine. At this point, our students have gone on to work for everyone from the tech companies like Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, et cetera, to UN commissions, to Interpol investigative teams, and ultimately trying to think through how they also strengthen groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, et cetera, and begin to build this out. But of course, that also brings you to some of the, both the advances and some of the concerns. There are several key events that have been milestones in the evolution of using digital open source information for legal accountability. The downing of the plane MH17 over the Ukraine in 2014 was one such milestone. As you may remember, at the time, Russia was hotly contesting their engagement in the downing of that flight. Bellingcat and others, and certainly the Dutch forensic teams, began looking at videos and photographs of the plane and its destruction, and ultimately weaving together the threads to show Russian complicity in that crime. Another big marker, at least at the international criminal justice level, has been the Al-Mahdi case at the International Criminal Court. Al-Mahdi was an individual accused of the destruction of cultural heritage property in Mali, in Timbuktu in Mali. There were several videos that have been circulating of him actually engaged in the cultural destruction at the time. Two big milestones with that particular case. One was a geolocation report that came to hundreds of pages. A geolocation report is where you have videos and you map them onto satellite imagery to try to confirm the coordinates of where that video was likely shot as a form of corroboration around the where this took place. That was a big deal. Unfortunately, with Al-Mahdi, he pled guilty. Some say that it may have been because of the strength of the open and closed source digital materials that had been collected against him. But regardless, those of us who were trying to work on building out this field were disappointed in not getting to see how the judges would respond to this report. It was also notable for an interactive platform, and I know Brad Samuels is here today, so not to put too much pressure on him, and I know he's been a former speaker of the Newcomb Institute, but an interactive platform that would allow the judges to engage with the photos, the videos, the satellite imagery, see how they are situated in relation to each other, and better understand these sites of destruction. But again, we haven't had as much opportunity to see how that plays out. There is a second case, though, the Al Hassan case, for a similar set of incidents that took place in Mali, also for cultural destruction of heritage property. And now, finally, we're getting a chance to see how some of these methods are playing out at trial. Finally, the Al-Warfali case at the ICC was another milestone. Al-Warfali was a member of the Al-Saika Brigade in Libya who's been accused of the extrajudicial killing of 33 people. 7 videos were posted to Facebook that showed him or members of his unit killing these individuals. And it was the first time in 2017 that the International Criminal Court had ever issued an international arrest warrant, largely on the basis of social media content. And so I think it really established how social media-based information could be used to ultimately engender some kind of international response. And of course, was something that we'd been working on with them since that time period in 2011. In Al Hassan, we now have the geolocation report that was created for that first case. We are also looking at how the additional photographs and videos are playing out as forms of evidence. As part of this, in our establishment of the Berkeley Protocol on Digital Open Source Investigations with the United Nations, this was just released in December of this year in its English-based advanced version. It will be formally released later this year in all 7 languages of the UN, in part to provide this foundation for legal practice and the use of digital content. By any chance, does anyone recognize the place that is depicted on the cover? Okay, and you probably don't, because the trick on this was that it was a deep fake of satellite imagery. We worked with an artist and computer scientist, Dr. Ahmed El-Gamal, who is the founder and director of the Art and Artificial Intelligence Lab at Rutgers University. This was a solution to 2 challenges that we ultimately had. The first, no country wants to be the cover girl for war crimes. So it was a little sensitive at the UN which geographic point we would ultimately put on the cover. But we also figured it would serve as a warning because we knew that one of the next big things that's coming that may obstruct our ability to get justice will be deep fakes of satellite imagery that will ultimately make it even harder to do the work that is already so difficult. As part of this as well, we've been working really closely with the social media companies. In this particular instance that I have up here, the story Hate Book, we've been monitoring the genocide in Myanmar since 2016, so before the most recent outbreaks of violence. But unfortunately, as many of you may know, Facebook largely is access to the internet for many people in Myanmar. And in the context of unrest in that region, many of the monks and military who were promulgating hate speech against the Rohingya people were doing so on the Facebook platform. Well, Facebook at one point alleged that it was no longer circulating in their digital spaces. We went and found over 1,000 instances where that wasn't, in fact, true. We ended up providing that information to Steve Stecklow of Reuters, who at the time was working on a series of pieces with two reporter colleagues of his who'd been jailed in Myanmar about the ways that Facebook was being used to ultimately drive hate speech forward and foment this genocide. That piece went on to win a Pulitzer Prize for the quality of the work. But I think what's extra interesting about what's happening in this space is how deeply collaborative and how deeply multidisciplinary it is, and how these very discrete pieces of information like these photos and videos can be useful for more than one purpose. So in addition to doing this groundbreaking reporting and feeding into Steve's work, most recently, just a couple of weeks ago, there was a milestone decision in the United States District Courts in the District of Columbia. A couple of years ago, I believe it was a couple of years ago, the Gambia, the nation in Africa, sued Myanmar for allegations of genocide in the International Court of Justice. As part of that, they needed evidence of what was happening in Myanmar, and they had read Steve's piece about the 1,000 pieces of content that had been removed from Facebook's platform, but that we had. And so they went to the United States District Courts to try to compel Facebook to turn over that 1,000 pieces of content that you could no longer get from their platform so that it could feed in as evidence to proving complicity in genocide. And I think many of us will be really interested to see, and he specifically cites Steve's work many times throughout this piece, about the importance of getting this information from the social media companies themselves. I want to show you one of our most recent stories that we worked on, also involving Myanmar. This one is a little bit graphic, so if you do want to look away or step out, I will not be upset. This did air, though, publicly. This is a piece we did in partnership with the Associated Press. In this instance, they had heard about a lot of violence suddenly breaking out this past year on the ground in Myanmar, and they asked us to take to social media to see if we could begin to uncover what was actually happening. A lot of the major institutions, major media, had seen open source investigation as a nice to have. But with the global pandemic and the shelter-in-place orders, many were now realizing that this was a need to have in a very new type of environment where it was very difficult to get boots on the ground. In addition, shifting political winds and security situations can also make it quite difficult to go into sites of conflict when things are still quite hot. And so getting information to even begin to build the case that you should have the resources to get in the country can be quite helpful. So we went, and I think my colleague collected over 200,000 tweets that were showing what was happening in different pockets on the ground in Myanmar. From that, he distilled it down to a couple of thousand, and then ultimately to, I think it was roughly 130 incidents or so. The Associated Press ended up releasing a longer form piece that they called euphemistically body snatchers, because the phenomenon the team had detected was a practice of Myanmar military basically grabbing people, killing them, and then disappearing their bodies. And when their bodies were returned to their families, returning with a very different story about what had killed their loved one than what you could see from the physical evidence and what remained. So this was a side piece, an explainer that they put together to try and help their audiences understand some of these new digital methods that have been used as part of the fact-finding.
More than 800 people have died in Myanmar since the military takeover in February. 17-year-old Jia Min-lat was one of them. His death is among a string of incidents where security forces have grabbed people off the streets, some never to be found again. The tactic has been used in other conflicts worldwide to create fear and anxiety among the population.
What is new is that this is taking place on the street and in public view. Normally, this kind of enforced disappearance takes place at night in the shadows without any public awareness of it.
Together with UC Berkeley's Human Rights Center Investigations Lab, the Associated Press analyzed photos, video, and social media posts and identified more than 130 cases where security forces have beaten, mutilated, or snatched bodies. Witnesses and family members have corroborated several of the accounts.
So this shows all of our incidents that we've identified.
Our initial collection was roughly 2,000 to 3,000 tweets over a span of about 2 months. And so from there, the challenge is just working through the large volume of posts.
So many people are retweeting and reposting the media that's originally circulated. And that in and of itself presents a lot of challenges when it comes to verifying the material, because there will be different claims of what's going on in the video based on who's posting it, based on when it was posted.
Among the posts circulating was the video of Jamin Lat.
What's really remarkable about this motorcycle incident that happened in Myanmar is that just how well documented it is from the beginning to the end.
Using satellite imagery, screen grabs of the footage, reverse image searches, and a sun shadow calculator, researchers verified the shooting took place in front of a high school in Da Wei on March 27th. The incident begins at 10:38 a.m. with the sound of gunshots captured on CCTV. 16 minutes later, the first image surfaces on social media. The post mentions that a man was taken by the military and asks if anyone recognizes the bike. Within 2 hours, this CCTV footage is shared widely. The picture showed the same fence where Jamin Lat was shot while riding with 2 other men on a motorcycle. The bike is later left in the same position captured in the photos. When the teen's bodies returned to his family days later, the official death certificate states he died from falling off a motorcycle. Another photo posted by a local news outlet shows a large wound in the teen's neck. Human rights experts say the trove of videos and images from Myanmar could serve another purpose as well.
If individuals who are committing that crime can be identified, it puts them at great legal liability in terms of crimes against humanity.
While Jamin Lat's family was able to hold a funeral, the military has cremated or secretly buried an unknown number of bodies. After a 13-year-old boy was killed by a stray bullet, his family refused to turn him over to authorities. Instead, they hid the body and cremated him the next day. David Martin, The Associated Press.
So in this particular instance, reporters were being jailed and people were not able to do the traditional reporting that would normally help to get information out to a broader global and international justice community. Just to show one other example, we have also worked with a number of legal partners, including the Open Society Justice Initiative, Syrian Archive, et cetera, to file some of the first cases in Europe against the Syrian regime for alleged chemical weapons attacks. Our team did a lot of the open source investigation at several sites that were alleged, where these attacks were alleged to have occurred, and pulled together very lengthy open source investigation reports for our legal partners, and then ultimately created a very public-facing version of that so that people had a better understanding of what was happening with the case. This is a particular piece that I think for the sake of time I may skip, but it is the beginning of me wanting to talk about there's a lot of opportunity here with social media and interconnectivity that I think needs to be thought about from all these different disciplinary perspectives, but also there's a dark side and cautionary tales that I think we need to be aware of simultaneously as this area of practice is growing and maturing. In this particular piece pulled together by the New York Times Visual Investigations team, they investigate how allegations of Maduro burning humanitarian aid trucks in Venezuela was attributed to Maduro. And ultimately that was tweeted out by a reporter on the ground. Ultimately, people in the highest levels of the United States government picked up that misinformation that Maduro had directly ordered the burning of humanitarian aid trucks, and ultimately it resulted in sanctions against Maduro and his regime. However, the New York Times visual investigation here shows how ultimately that initial tweet was likely misinformation. and actually trace the burning of a rag that came from one of the activists that likely ignited the first truck that quickly scaled. And it shows on some of the missing footage that was not reported in the news how actually police at the site were trying to get people to back off and to work together to prevent the burning of the trucks. So the real world ramifications are quite severe for the kinds of mis and disinformation that we're seeing today. It also is such a poignant illustration of how quickly a single tweet can be catalyzing for major geopolitical conflict. First Draft News, of course, has done a whole typology of mis and disinformation, putting it ultimately on a spectrum of intent to deceive to lack of intent to deceive. I mean, this might be things, some of the stuff that we've seen that is most compelling. There's a picture that Amnesty International and we train on of 2 young children who are Asian. And we were told originally that it was 2 children who are Rohingya orphans from Myanmar. Amnesty, when they did the training, you have to do what's called a reverse image search of that photo to see where else it might have popped up in digital spaces online. What you quickly find is that most major media reported on an earthquake in Nepal in 2015 using the exact same photo. However, if you dig into the 3rd page of the Google search results, you also find that even they got it wrong. And this is actually a picture from Vietnam in 2007. And it first accompanied a story about children in that particular country. So the ways that mass major media are even promulgating this misinformation, not necessarily intentionally, but picking up threads that people use to illustrate their stories, the pain that they've been going through in very compelling ways can be deeply problematic for getting at the truth. There's also an issue of ethics. In the book Digital Witness, one of the things we wanted to cover, in addition to telling people how you could use some of this open source information for justice and accountability, was some of the warnings. And one of the big things that I know many of us know is a challenge with new forms of digital technology is this caution that just because you can doesn't mean you should. And the importance of always asking both questions together and using them to pivot off each other in finding a way forward. Particularly for us as human rights organizations, I think we have such a deep ethical obligation to people to ensure that we are getting this right and we're using digital technologies, that we're aware of the harms that can come from these particular uses. When I first started teaching on this at Berkeley, I was showing students how to get underneath people's Facebook pages and Twitter profiles and how we could triangulate this information to understand networks. And about a month in, a young woman raised her hand and said, "But Alexa, what about the ethics of what we're trying to do?" And I was horrified to realize that I had never come across ethics specific to open source information. And so I began furiously looking to see what was out there. Most of the journalists who were working in the space were talking about things like, can you take someone's video from a tweet and just reuse it in your reporting without giving credit, or without paying them or getting consent and approval to use that imagery? That was important, of course, but it also didn't cover the full breadth of ethical issues that we were beginning to see emerge. So we began to look at legal ethics and what it provided in terms of guidance, journalistic ethics, social science ethics, and none of them were directly on point because so many of the challenges that we were having were so specific to digital spaces and the ways that information leaks out in places online that we began talking with a lot of our colleagues about what should be the ethical approach to moving forward. Where we've begun to land, and I think this is very much in flux and really depends on people from across areas of practice working together, is to first ask when we're faced with a quandary, what are my legal obligations? So that if you break the law, you do so at least knowingly. Second, what are my professional ethical obligations? And then finally, there's an emerging field of OSINT ethics that we've begun to use as a form of applied ethics to help address practical normative challenges. These really ultimately hinge on the issues of dignity. How are we portraying people in their moments of suffering? Who has control and agency over how things are depicted and what information is used? The accuracy of the work that we're doing. How do we look under the hood of whether a tweet or a video or a photograph is reliable? How do we know the source from which it commenced? And then finally, security. And by that, we mean the physical, digital, and psychological security of all people who are potentially implicated in these investigations. That last part has been the hardest to work with computer scientists, to work with war crimes investigators. Inevitably, when I do trainings, they say they want all of the methods, but none of the psychosocial wellness and resiliency pieces. But they and their teams are ultimately going to be so bombarded with such a huge volume of graphic imagery that it's probably one of the most important pieces of learning that I think as a community of practice we can pass to each other. I love this quote by Rachel Naomi Remen. The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to walk through water without getting wet. So how do we figure out the kinds of psychological rain boots and raincoats and the ways we can work together to protect each other? And there's a whole set of tips and tricks with dealing with such graphic, emotive content that ultimately has been, I think, established and pulled together by many people in practice. And then I will wrap up pretty soon, but of course the other area where we are constantly in an arms race against people producing data is the growing facility with which deep fakes and even shallow fakes can be produced. So these are in some way, these are all faces of people who've never existed. I'm sure many of the people in this room are very familiar with the concept of a deep fake. For us as investigators, it's in some ways a fantastic technology. We do not want to put ourselves and our teams and the people we're working for at risk by revealing our own identities when we're going into spaces online. But at the same time, it is just as easy for people who don't want to be found or to be known to do the same thing. And it's making the work of verification and source analysis so much more challenging. And then, of course, I've also talked about this growing risk of satellite imagery deepfakes. Finally, one of the issues we've been working on with the major social media platforms is what do they do with the content they take down because it's too graphic to leave up? The beheadings, the massacres, et cetera, that they don't want to expose their publics to, and for very good reason, but that they know have tremendous human rights value and importance for justice and accountability purposes. So for the last 7 years, we've been talking with them about how do you create some kind of repository or archive to safely house that data and ultimately feed it into the hands of people who can do something helpful with it. Of course, that comes with its own sets of challenges around the ethics of who has access, who has control over that information, who holds onto it, what jurisdiction is it in, and ultimately, that's something that we're now trying to explore with them more actively. Additionally, I think I'm also concerned about how these new forms of technology and investigation have created new potential for knowing what's happening in disparate parts of the globe. But at the same time, it may also begin to distort our understanding of what's happening in different parts of the globe. So of course, there's everything from access bias, who actually is able to share their stories in online spaces. There's machine bias, which stories are the algorithms most likely to detect and put in front of investigators when they're looking for information that they don't know exists. And then, of course, the human biases of how we interpret that information, what we choose to notice. There's that saying that it's not what you look at, it's what you see. And certainly working with gender experts on cases of sexual and gender-based violence, I think the thing that I've heard over and over is that it really does matter who the investigator is and who's on their team. The more diverse that can be, the more powerful and impactful these investigations actually are. We just released a special issue for the Journal of International Criminal Justice, looking at the ways new and emerging technologies are beginning to strengthen this space and beginning to think about what comes next. Everything from using object detection, natural language processing to help make the scale problem a little bit more manageable, to thinking through how we begin to look at this area of practice from the perspective of the cases that are hardest to prosecute. And how do we help this enrich the stories of the people who don't have access to some of the people in the highest international spaces. I'll close with Michelle Bachelet, the current United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, who partnered with us on creating these global standards. She says that the protocol is ultimately about protecting human rights and advancing justice. And in this regard, she welcomes in particular its principles of humility, of inclusivity, and dignity. Finally, to close with the story of Estela Carlota. Ultimately, the work that Eric Stover did in Argentina became the genesis for much of what we're doing with digital technologies today. He figured out with a number of other people how DNA technology could be helpful for human rights purpose and ultimately leveraged the extraordinary talents of students to do that, something that we are continually trying to explore. In 2015, 36 years after her daughter Laura was killed, Estela Carlotto finally found that there was a DNA match and that her grandson had been found. Ignacio Montoya Carlotto had been adopted out to a rural family in Argentina, and he had decided at one point to just go put his information into a database after learning at the age of 36 that he had been adopted himself. So the woman who had started this movement to try and find these lost children ultimately found a way to find her lost grandchild. I think what it leaves with us is the potential of new technologies to actually have impact, but also a reminder of just how long that arc of justice can be. Thank you.
Alexa, thank you. So we have time for a couple of questions. There's anybody in the audience, if any? So, yeah.
Do Facebook and Google, do they have anybody like Human Rights Division? I mean, do they have anybody who specializes in this kind of thing at all?
Yes, and I think we're going to have to use the microphones for them to capture it, but maybe I can just repeat your question for the microphones. So the question was, do Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, have people who work in this space? And the answer is yes. So particularly over the last 2 to 3 years, I've been very heartened by the people that they're bringing in to run human rights policy at each of the platforms. Many of them have very deep and long-standing human rights experience, including boots on the ground experience. They come from places like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch themselves, and are deeply committed to a lot of the issues. Some of it was in response to Myanmar and the ways these platforms were being leveraged to promulgate hate, and the recognition by the companies that it's not in their best interest to have people using them, and ultimately the public relations and other pushback that can ultimately occur. So we are actively working with a lot of those human rights policymakers to try and figure out what are the ways we can translate some of these human rights imperatives in ways that will resonate and ultimately create incentives for the companies themselves, who are often focused on a very different set of interests, to actually help conform a lot of their practices in ways that safeguard human beings. Thanks.
Hey, Alexa.
Hi.
Thanks for a great talk and for
Thank
your
you.
work. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about some of that psychosocial kit, right? I mean, one of the things that I was thinking as I was watching is how much at risk students in particular, and I know many of the folks that you're working with are graduate students. Here, we would be thinking also about undergrads, like thinking about what it means to engage students in this work, which they obviously find meaningful, and that's fantastic, but I think it has potential drawbacks that are hard to manage, and I wonder if you could talk a bit about that.
Absolutely, and I think that's been the cornerstone of a lot of what we've really been deeply focused on for the last 6 years. When we first launched the lab and first did a little bit of a demo of what was possible, I did it for one of our advisory board members, who's a very well-known war reporter, and she came up to me afterwards, she's like, Alexa, this is incredible what these students can do, but how are you gonna keep these kids safe? And I think knowing about her life experiences, and then also working with Sam Dubberly of Amnesty International, who had just led a major study about the psychological ramifications of human rights work. Thankfully, when he was doing some of the initial training, he really created a sensitivity to that. It is probably our biggest concern. What we are trying to do now is really frame this around how do you prepare these students who are deeply dedicated to human rights issues to do the work for the long haul? How do you ensure that they don't burn out or that they don't acquire depression to the extent that you can? And as a result, we've come up with kind of a 4-pronged program that we use on a regular basis. The first part is really helping students from the very first day build their awareness of who they are, what their baseline is, how often they eat, how often they sleep, how often they go out with other human beings, so that they can watch for themselves when that begins to slip. And we actually have them journaling about it so that there's some written record that they can use as a tether in case they need to be pulled out. We also have done a lot of work on pairing up students so that there is someone else who's kind of keeping an eye out for you. And I've definitely had it be that students will come to me and say, hey, so-and-so seems like she's suddenly showing up late to everything, and that's not like her. And we may do an informal check-in. We also let the campus psychological health department, we had them come in and we did a whole training for them on what we do and how we do that, so that if students self-refer or we refer them out, there is somebody there who really deeply understands the ramifications of this work. That's on the awareness awareness side. The second prong are the tips and tricks. So I do think from psychological research and other research, one thing we do know is that a lot of the emotive quality in video is from the sound. So the person pleading for their life, crying for their child. So what I do whenever I watch a particularly difficult video, like the killing of George Floyd, for example, I'll watch it the first time through without the sound on so I can prepare my brain for what is coming and be able to adjust. The other is we train students, if they don't need to be doing detailed work, to keep the screen really small. You don't need to be bombarded, to turn off autoplay on all of your social media so you're not being surprised. The element of surprise is such a big piece of this that we really, even when we're working across big teams, we now have spreadsheets, and every spreadsheet has a column in red where you can flag this link is going to take you to something graphic and a short descriptor of what it is. For many students, they don't know till they do the work what will impact them and how. So I had one student who was from Syria who was working on Syria, and he finally came to me after 2 weeks and he said, "This is way too politically sensitive. My family worked with the regime, and I can't do this anymore." And because of his experience, we created a no questions asked policy that they could drop a project or change, and we would not ask any questions, but we would find a more suitable project for them. On the contrary, another woman came to me, she was Iranian, and she said, "I've been hearing my whole life about what my family has suffered, and this is the first time I've ever been able to do anything about it." And for her, it was actually restorative. So I also don't want to be overly prescriptive in the students, but we now have a class that we require them to go through first, so they get the basic trainings on psychosocial security and resiliency before they start touching this material. And in the class, they might try geolocating a video too to even see if they want to start engaging in the work. I think the promising part has been actually beginning to seed through them this deep commitment to ethics and the deep commitment to resiliency. So our students have now gone on, like I was mentioning, to the Washington Post, the New York Times, and I think they're really helping to change the culture between people who, across areas of practice, were really using alcohol and other means of coping that maybe aren't really coping at all. But this is a huge area where we often do hours worth of training, and it's not a one and done. It's a daily conversation that we have. Oh, and the final thing I'd say is community. And that was the hardest thing with the pandemic, is isolation is deeply problematic for psychological well-being and your ability to be resilient with this kind of content. So we would actually have Zoom sessions where we're working in parallel with each other and are trying to convince a lot of the foundations and funders of this work that they really need to be investing in building community, bringing people together so that there are networks of support and people aren't quite so isolated.
Yeah, thank you so much for the fascinating dive into your work. My question piggybacks on Jackie's, I think. I have a question about the status of the witness under digital conditions. Because you could say that in the traditional sense, the witness is a witness because he or she uses his body to gather evidence and to testify in a way with the body. And a lot of the technology that you are working with is disembodied, right? Satellite images, drones, etc. And so could one say that in a way the work that you do gives bodies back to technology? I mean, your bodies, you're doing the witnessing work that cannot be done by the technology?
It's a great question, and I think there's more work that probably needs to be done on the relationship between witnessing and this work. I mean, if you think about how many witnesses are actually present in the chain of getting information from, like, witnessing the event in the immediate moment, all the people who are depicted in that particular video who are also present, the person who uploaded it is a witness, all of us on social media who may have come across it are a witness, and then ultimately the person who's collecting that information and may have to testify in court about its capture, its chain of custody, et cetera, may also be a form of witness. So I do think it provides a lot of opportunities for potentially getting more voices into the courtroom or ensuring that some voices are heard who couldn't be there physically. That said, though, also, I think one of the things that we're hearing from a lot of international courts and tribunals is that they would like an expert witness or a lay witness to actually be present in the courtroom in addition to the videos and the photographs that we have, who can talk about how that originated and ideally get the person who actually captured the information. In lieu of that, it's going to be the witness who actually found it and analyzed it and is attesting to its reliability. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexa. Great presentation and super work. My question goes to the 3 different audiences that you direct this to, and I think if I remember it was the media, legal institutions, and then human rights organizations, I think. But I'm curious to hear what you've learned about making those choices strategically, and kind of whether you think you favor one over the other for taking this evidence to, and and how you approach that.
I think the central component of that is impact. So where are we at the chain of accountability where we can have the greatest impact? So for example, if something has already been taken up by an international criminal court, it may be that the legal component of this is going to be the most supportive and helpful. But in the early stages of conflict, there is a real need, and this is something I wrote about in Hiding in Plain Sight, one of the books I worked on with Eric Stover and Victor Peskin, where our question was, how do you get that accountability in the first place? And what it really comes down to is building the political will. And this is where I see the work of journalists and human rights researchers as being so incredibly critical, because they're the ones that get this message out to broader publics that can then put pressure on governments to respond, and perhaps pressure the government that may be doing the abusing to change their practices. So, and then with the human rights research groups, a lot of times we're doing it to feed into diplomatic work. So they have high-level officials who are going and meeting with heads of government and trying to pressure the cessation of hostility or providing some form of humanitarian aid. So I think it is a very strategic question, and we do have a strong network of people who are working on all those prongs. What I ideally like to see is sort of all those links in a chain, ultimately going from the person on the ground who witnesses the moment until you get it into that courtroom, and conceivably after. How do we think about the dignity of each piece and what needs to happen to actually effectuate change that protects human lives? But it's not always straightforward, and I think as we've seen in Myanmar, there can ultimately be many different people who really need that underlying data or can benefit from it. But I will say this, in teaching in the journalism school now, it's been fascinating to me how cautious lawyers are about journalists and how cautious journalists are about lawyers. And a lot of them have challenged me about why I'd work with the other side. And I think a lot of times it's really about convincing them that I think as long as we know what we're out there to do, it's probably okay. Lawyers have had a hard time with the journalists because they're like, they don't realize that if you talk to someone who's just experienced an atrocity, you're ruining that person as a witness, and they may want to get legal justice. And then you've got the journalist saying, don't tell me what to do, and by the way, we can't share sources with anybody, so you can't share the data you shared with us, with the legal investigators. Turns out that's not always the issue. The digital environment really has created kind of a new sandbox, I think, for thinking that through, and who has propriety over information. So what I might push back on some of the journalists about is, this is information that we gathered, we're happy to give it to you, we're happy to give it to the lawyers, but it's not propriety to necessarily any individual or any profession. It's really the stuff that's been created by the people on the ground. And hopefully that becomes part of the equation as well. What did they want to have happen with this data that they've been sharing? And if we can honor that, then that's even better.
That feels like a good valedictory. So.
Okay.
Thank you. All right. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to Christine and David for arranging this and setting up what's outside, which is a nice little refreshment. And see some of you later. So, bye-bye.